The Congress gave a hearing to the report of Comrade Kosygin about the main areas of development of the national economy of the USSR for the forthcoming 5-year period.
Now here in the Kremlin, when I was going to see Kosygin, everything was different. Stalin's office was still preserved. The office where so many decisions had been made about the destiny of the country and destinies of the peoples. In the history of the siege, there were many different forms of hushing up. Among these was the role of Alexei Nikolaevich Kosygin, who was the authorized representative of the State Defense Committee during the siege. And for some reason, his name did not show up anywhere. Once, they brought me a shorthand report with the memoirs of the participants of the Road of Life. And one speaker says there, why is it that the role of Kosygin has not been demonstrated either in Tchaikovsky's novel about the siege or in feature films, while this was a very significant role? Both Alois Adamovich and myself came up with the idea to show the role of Kosygin, the more so because we liked him. We began to look for possibilities. One of the possibilities offered to us was acquainted with his assistant from those years of the siege, Boldyrev, and so we addressed him. Is there not a possibility to speak to Kosygin? To speak about what, he asked. Well, about how he worked during the siege. He waved his hands at us. He is the chairman of the Council of Ministers. No, don't even think about it. Still, we held on to Boldyrev and began to persuade him and insist. Why not, strictly speaking? What reasons might there be? I don't know whether he spoke to Kosygin or not. They were still keeping in touch. But in the end, he said, well, why try to write a paper about this? And list the questions which interest you. Well, a list of questions. We were interested in everything. Almost half a year had gone by, and suddenly, one fine day, Boldyrev called and told me to come to Moscow the next day. I said, shall we both come? No, you come alone, and would not explain anything on the phone. I came. I called him, and he told me, at 4 o'clock sharp, go down from the hotel. I'll be waiting for you, car number so-and-so, and we will go. Who, what, when, where, ask no questions. Such, secrecy about it. Well, I went down, and we go. We head to the Kremlin. Nothing on the way either. They drive me to the Kremlin, through the Spassky gates. We arrive and I take out my tape recorder. Boldyrev asks me, what is it? I say, a tape recorder. Well, why? To record the story of Kosygin. I doubt it, says Boldyrev. Well, I am going regardless. We are checked at the first checkpoint, a second checkpoint, and a third checkpoint until we finally got to Kosygin's receiving room. Well, we waited for some minutes. Then they lead us to the office. We are invited into the office. The office has a writing table and a small table here. We sat at this small table. Kosygin, me, Boldyrev, no one else, and a telephone with an anthem on this table. Kosygin says, "What is that?" I say, "A tape recorder, to record what you say." I ask, should I just jot it down in my notebook with a pencil? Well, all right, you may do it in pencil, but on one condition, that when you are through writing them, you give all records to Boldyrev, so we can check them. Well, all right. What could I do? He is the boss here. We sat at the table, the three of us. But before sitting, I scrutinized the room. Something familiar to me was in that room. I had seen it somewhere. Had seen it many times. And finally I thought of it. I did not even say anything then. Just looked at Kosygin inquiringly and say, "This is a very familiar office, although I'm only here for the first time." And he tells me this is Stalin's office. And I thought, oh my God. Here, from this small door, the leader of the nations entered here in those soft Caucasian boots of his. This leader, you see, took decisions about the destinies of dozens, hundreds, and millions of people. The most horrid and tragic issues were resolved here, about the resettlement of peoples, executions, exterminations. Perhaps, I don't know exactly, something showed on my face. Kosygin gave me such a gloomy look. And I should tell you that, in general, Kosygin was someone that we both liked, both Adamovich and myself. I cannot even tell where this feeling came from, as we knew nothing about the life, the personalities of these members of the Politburo or the leader. There was Stalin, and there were the members of the Politburo. But Kosygin somehow stood apart from the rest by his gloominess, his kind of... He never gave any promises. He more or less kept aloof from all this party pathos. And one could tell he was a man of business. The man of business. Yes, and some previous life history of his did show through. His experience as an industrialist and an economic executive. That is why I, in general, internally inclined towards him. Although the fact that he occupied Stalin's office and is in some way related to Stalin, not exactly the piety, but in any case the understanding that he is working in a historically relevant room, which unfortunately has disappeared after the reconstruction. And this is about one of the only places, possibly where the receiving office was, the office of Kosygin. It's a pity it has been destroyed, because this is our history. Kosygin said that in August, at the end of August, a group of the country's top executives were sent to Leningrad upon Stalin's instructions. This delegation was led by Molotov. He was the chairperson. He was the chair. There was Kuznetsov, the Minister of the Navy. There was Beria. There was Malenkov and Kosygin. The plane earthed somewhere near Cherepovets because there was air combat going on. They went from Cherepovets to MGA station by train. There was an air raid warning. They all disembarked the coach and ended up in some ditch filled with water. And there they sat, in fact, all of our leaders. I think many of them were under bombing at the front line for the first and for the last time in their lives. Kosygin said, I asked Kuznetsov, he is at least a military man, let us go and see what's going on there. They went, saw a military train standing. They came up to a sentry and asked, whose train is it? He pounced on them with a rifle, with a bayonet. Well, he saw two people in civilian clothes at night. They managed to calm him down and call for the senior officer, who then managed to communicate with Leningrad, with Voroshilov. Voroshilov sent an armored train after them. And by morning, all of them got to Leningrad. In Moscow, they could not even imagine what was going on in Leningrad. They worked for 3 days in Leningrad and formed some image of what was going on. Finally, the resolution was made to withdraw Voroshilov and appoint Zhukov. Stalin said after 3 days that everybody was to come back, except for Kosygin. He had to deal with the evacuation of the industry. The next time Kosygin appeared in Leningrad in 1942, according to his story, he says, just before the new year, I am sitting in my office in the Kremlin working. He was deputy of the chairman of the Council of People's Commissars at the time. I'm working at the Kremlin. Suddenly a phone rings. This is Popkov. Popkov, who used to be the chairman of the Leningrad Council at the time and had come to Moscow on some business. He says, what are you doing? Well, I'm sitting and working, but this is the new year coming. Let us go somewhere. To whom? Popkov says, I will phone Nikolai Voznevsky, who used to be the chairman of the Gosplan back then. So we will arrange and sit, the three of us. He says, well, yes. So he talked to Voznesiensky, and they arranged to meet at the cinematography committee to watch some film, a comedy, and then sit for some time. They went there. We sat there and watched a comedy, says Kosygin, and they hand me the telephone. This is Stalin calling. Stalin asks, what are you doing? I say, just sitting watching a comedy. With whom? I say, Popkov, Voznesiensky. Then Stalin kept silent for some time, and then he says, why did you meet? I tell him how we met. He was again silent, then said, come to me now. Well, I apologized to my fellows, and then I left. There was Malenkov, Beria, Molotov, Shostokov. They were celebrating, and I sat with them. We are celebrating the New Year. And it was there he told me I should go to Leningrad and handle the evacuation of the industry and the population. He told me this, and I couldn't help myself. I told him, well, Stalin, He wanted to check his immediate fellows in arms, why you had gathered, how. These words just escaped me. And suddenly Kosygin banged his fist on the table and did not exactly shout, but said very sharply, "It is not for you to discuss Stalin." This was so rude, so unlike all our previous conversation, so insulting, such a bark, that I was silent and shut my notebook. I thought, thank God we do not have Adamovich with us. There was a condition that only one could be present. Maybe Kosygin invited me as a person from Petersburg. And suddenly silence came. I shut the notebook and decided to myself, well, to hell with this all, indeed. At that time, it was 1978, 1979. I don't remember exactly. Everything was still boiling about the cult of Stalin's personality. All these disclosures. All this was so painfully agonizing for the people and myself that I decided I would not make up to him here. And I should say he very quickly, sharply switched the conversation, evidently trying to make up for his rudeness. He switched the conversation to an absolutely different subject. It is somehow interesting for me, and I even liked it, those events in Moscow on October 16th. A critical day for Moscow, when the Germans approached Moscow very closely, and some kind of panic started in the city. He told me about the following episode. It is October 16th. The government has mostly left Moscow. The Kremlin is empty. All the telephones were ringing in all the offices. The ringing of phones, Kosygin says, and I was there alone. And I rushed from one office to another and picked up the phones to show that there are people in the Kremlin. There was one responsible executive who did not say his name. He said, "Well, shall we surrender Moscow?" Kosygin said, "Are you ready for this? Have you prepared yourself?" And hung up the phone. I think it was not by chance that he told me this, because with such an experienced politician as Kosygin, there would hardly be anything in this story by sheer chance. Maybe he wanted to show in this way the difference between Leningrad and Moscow in these critical circumstances, how Leningraders behaved and how Moscow bureaucrats behaved. I don't know, but in any case, the way to further the conversation was open. When Kosygin arrived in Leningrad, he had his main task to solve, to create the conditions for the evacuation. Evacuation was done over thin ice, 300 horses, 300 sleds, and a string of carts, which went to and from over Lake Ladoga, this thin, pulsating vein, which ensured some tiny evacuation of the wounded, children, civilians, and supplies of an insignificant amount of foodstuffs to Leningrad. They started to wait for the ice to become stronger. This was some kind of interesting operation. On the one hand, Leningraders begged God for the frosts not to come. And those building the road of life begged that the ice became stronger and it would be possible to drive the trucks. There must be frosts, and there must not be frosts. This was a huge economy that had to be created. Kosygin led all of this work. And right away, the most difficult problems emerged. Economical problems and moral problems. He and all the creators and managers of the road of life had to make this agonizing choice every day. When they should evacuate from Leningrad, whom to evacuate, specialists, children, women, wounded, or should they take out the machines, metals, apparatuses, everything that the evacuated plants and factories, our industry, needed so badly? Either or. And each time they had to choose. I asked Kosygin, how did you choose? He said, and how? What could we choose? We needed both this and that. Kosygin displayed his temper. He had managed the road of life. I recalled another detail. Between us was this white telephone. And from time to time, Kosygin would have a look at it, or it just seemed so to me. But this was another witness, the fourth creature which was present at our conversation. Kosygin was the only leader during that time who was from Leningrad. By his origins and his connections, he was from Leningrad. And he was the only one who escaped the Leningrad case, whom this case had passed. Either Stalin decided to preserve him as an experienced economic executive, as a man who could skillfully and ably deal with industry-related matters with the national economy, or there were some other ideas. I do not know. But in any case, perhaps he thought they had just taken mercy on him. On saying goodbye, I decided to make use of our meeting after all. And I said, Alexei Nikolaevich, you know, we meet very many obstacles with this publication of our book about the siege. They think that everything we want to publish, all this does not comply with our official policies. He said so ironically, well, certainly, they know the siege better than others. He adapted all these records. We wanted to include it into the Leningrad Under Siege, but the censors crossed it out point blank. And for how long after that, and after Adamovich's death, no matter how hard I tried to include it in this book, I did not succeed. And the thing was that, at the time, the book that was published, which was considered the main book about war, about our life, The Small Land by Brezhnev. And, as they told me, it was impossible to publish the story told by Kosygin. The story, which by far did not have any of the significance or real participation in the war as the publication by Brezhnev.